Today marks the 85th anniversary of the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria in 1938. Now there are some myths out there, one that usually originates from Austria and one that sometimes comes from Germany. And the funny thing is we can address both of them at once. Now the Austrian myth is usually that Austria was the first victim of Hitler, and the German one is sometimes that a large majority of Austrians voted for Hitler, whereas only a smaller part of Germans voted for Hitler, because I think he had around 30% for the Reichstag, whereas the Anschluss had like way more than 90% approval rating. Letting aside some rigging and other stuff here, let's look at the situation which should clear up that both of these myths are just that, myths. So we could look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but let's just look at the end of it, because let's skip the long part. So in 1918, in November, when the First World War ended, Austria was declared as Deutschösterreich, German-Austria. So additionally, all major parties were for an Anschluss with Germany, for several reasons. For one thing, most didn't consider Austria to be self-sufficient. Before, it was a large empire and we had a lot of resources coming in from different areas. This wasn't the case anymore. So in certain areas, especially rural ones, it was underdeveloped. Then the socialists famously proclaimed, mit einem Haufen Bauernschädel kann man keine sozialistische Revolution machen. With a bunch of stubborn peasants, you can't do a socialist revolution. So they needed the urban area of Germany, they thought, and the people in the industry. Quite interestingly, it seems Austrian socialists actually read Marx and understood him, unlike some others. I'm totally not looking at you, Soviet Union, right now. So anyway, back to the topic. So this situation already in 1918, basically a majority, both in the leadership and the general population, was for Anschluss with Austria. So why didn't it happen? Well, the Treaties of Versailles, and especially the Treaty for Austria, was called the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which is quite ironic considering that Austria was proclaimed as Deutschösterreich, and all the other names that were suggested included either Deutsch or Deutschland, German or Germany. Yet the Treaty of Versailles forbid this name, and it also prohibited the Anschluss to Germany. So it didn't happen in 1918. So then we look at the interwar period. And like in many countries, Austria faced a lot of problems. There was of course the world economic crisis, but already in 1918, since there were not enough resources coming in, there was a shortage of food and everything in Vienna. So troops from Vienna went out there to requisition food in the rural areas, which also created this constant conflict between the periphery and the center. And basically in the periphery, the Conservative Party was in charge, and in Vienna it was basically the socialists. So there was quite this conflict going on all the time. Ultimately, at one point, the conservatives were in charge and there was an issue in parliament which was quite complicated, but basically the parliament was out of action. And this is sometimes called Austro-fascism. And basically it's more like ultra-conservative and not really fascism, because fascism is to the far right but also is not conservative in certain aspects. This is something people mix up. But some people also call it Austro-fascism, whatever your take is. So basically in 1938 we already had an authoritarian regime. And also in 1934 we had two civil wars. The first one was the socialists against the conservatives who were in charge, and the second was the Nazis against the conservatives. So you can imagine by 1938 basically nobody was really happy in Austria, and of course in 20 years you can't develop a nation state from scratch, because Austria as the small part didn't have that much of an identity beforehand, and you need to build up an identity. And if you have 20 years of struggle, which is mainly internal struggle, you don't develop this sense of identity or a positive sense of identity. So when in 1938 the Wehrmacht came in, of course most people were happy because they were already looking to Germany, because at that point the German economy was back in the tracks. Most assumed due to the National Socialists, which is not true. There was many changes before. So everyone looked there for basically, for being rescued or whatever you want to call it. So this means, of course, that a lot of people were pro-Anschluss. Additionally, the Catholic Church, which has still a major influence in Austria, also noted vote for the Anschluss. So basically everyone said, yeah, let's vote for the Anschluss. Now, quite ironically, the Anschluss was probably very important for the identity of Austria itself, especially after the Second World War. Why is this the case? Well, in Austria we never really liked getting anything from Vienna, like being told what we should do. I mean, let's face it, who likes Vienna? I certainly don't. And we realized one thing during the Second World War, well, we even dislike orders from Berlin even more. So, yeah, the least necessary evil is in this case Vienna. And the other aspect was quite interestingly, when the Wehrmacht integrated the Bundesheer, the Austrian armed forces, it was done basically with a sledgehammer. So they were really forced, and I think they noted they felt like they were treated like a beaten army and not like the friends they welcomed them. So the treatment was quite harsh in putting them in different areas and reorganizing the whole Bundesheer into the Wehrmacht, and was done in brute force style, which already gave a certain part of officers and enlisted men a bad taste about the whole thing. Of course, at this time, everyone was still happy. So over the time, basically, the Anschluss led to establishment of Austrian identity in the long run, because you really know, you can only really experience what you dislike if you have experience with it. And before the Anschluss, basically, it was just this fairy tale about Germany and everything, about the National Socialists. But then during the war, we saw what came with it. Well, I hope you learned something new, and I could bring you some context for the whole Anschluss and the relations between Austria and Germany in the long run. Well, thank you for watching, and see you next time.